So now I'd really delighted to introduce our speaker today, who of course is Henry Dimbleby. And Henry, you're no stranger to our Centre for Food Policy. Henry was the keynote speaker at our City Food Symposium in 2019, but that seems like a long time ago now, before publication of your National Food Strategy, which of course was the independent review of the UK food systems, which Henry led, and culminated in 14 key recommendations that really aim to kickstart transformation of food systems across our nation so that they could be healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable. But the lack of take-up of these recommendations by the UK government has prompted Henry to become a prolific food campaigner. Henry understands food and business systems well. He was the co-founder of the food chain Leon and worked in private equity, helping large companies to develop their strategies. He was also a commerce chef at the Michelin-starred Inn on the Park restaurant in London. Henry speaks on how to create a purpose-led business and how to create better food systems to a wide range of audiences. And we really are delighted and looking forward to your assessment today, Henry, on what you think are the critical food policy actions that the new UK government can and should undertake in their first 100 days and beyond. So welcome, Henry, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christina. I thought it would be useful to just talk about the nature briefly of the food transition, talk about what we know from Labour at the moment, which is very little in terms of their ambition or specific policy, and then think about where they might go from here over the next 100 days. There are over 350 of us here, and I'm sure that many of you are more expert than me, so very happy to keep I've got the Q&A open on my screen on the right. Very happy to make that thoughts as well. I'd be interested in some of your thoughts on some of these topics as well as questions. So please, have a discussion there. I don't have all, if any, of the answers, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you have to say. I think that where do you start? I have, since kind of doing the food strategy, and seeing how that landed and kind of following the food transition since July of 2021, which is when we published, I've come to believe a couple of things. First of all, I've come to see the food system transition as the second big societal transition after energy and transport. So in my mind, if you're thinking about how to fix society, the first transition required is energy and transport. The second is food, because as everyone on this call will know, the food system is the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse, of water shortage, of water pollution, freshwater pollution, the collapse of aquatic life, soil degradation, deforestation. After fossil fuels, it's the second biggest cause of climate change, and it's the biggest cause of avoidable ill health. And in fact, for the Labour government, not only is that an important transition in itself, but they aren't going to have any chance of succeeding in 2 of their 5 missions without tackling the food system. And those two missions are kickstarting growth. Under the Tory government a few months ago, I was called into Treasury to talk to Treasury officials and political advisors, and that was because within the Tory government it was Treasury who were really worried about health, because they'd looked at the 2.8 million people who were out of work, the highest number of people on long-term sick leave in history, and they had realized that there were 4 conditions that were affecting those people: musculoskeletal problems, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, coronary heart disease, and mental health, and that 3 of those were directly caused by food. And one of them was mental health was exacerbated by food. So Treasury was thinking, we're not going to kickstart growth, improve productivity without dealing with food. So, if you don't solve the food problem, not only do people not work, you also then get less money into the NHS, less money in tax receipts. And that is the second mission of the Labour government, this idea of building an NHS fit for the future that they cannot do without fixing the food system. And I actually think that the framing of that isn't quite right. It isn't enough to build an NHS fit for the future. You have to build a future which the NHS can cope with. And there is quite a lot in the manifesto, not very specific about prevention, but you cannot, that there is no NHS that can deal with the problems that an unfixed food system will throw on it. It's just not, it's unimaginable. And so we have the second big transition, this idea that the Labour government cannot succeed in two of their missions without tackling it. And then the other thing that's really been on the forefront of my mind is actually what an opportunity we have here in the UK to show how this can be done. So we have already, and I think that if you look at the Tories' response to the food strategy, actually they did or kicked off most of the stuff on the environment. They went backwards on health. And we have a framework for the most progressive environmental and agricultural legislation in the world, farming legislation. We are the third or fourth largest, depending on which figures you look at, importer of food in the world. So we have the opportunity through responsible trade deals to spread those environmental standards abroad. We have huge health problems, but also we have the NHS, which means that those health problems are felt by the state rather than by insurers. And we have this, what the NHS has in spades over other countries is digital data. So over 90%. I mean, if I were to ask you, what did you think the levels of digitized health records were in Germany compared with the UK? I was asked this the other day. I didn't know the answer. And I knew that the UK was highly digitized, but I was surprised to learn that over 90% of the health records in the NHS are digitized, not linked, but digitized, whereas under 5% of German health records are digitized. So that gives us a real opportunity to understand the scale of the health problem and look at societal solutions. And then finally, the extraordinary power that we have in our academia, and particularly in biological sciences. And I think this is important, not just for, the biotech solutions, the replacement of fossil fuel inputs in farming and so forth. But I think that we're fundamentally at the beginning of a real transition in how we understand complex biological systems. So I was a physicist as an undergraduate, and the way I kind of have begun to look at it is, for me as a physicist, calculus, which was invented in the late 17th century, without calculus, none of modern physics would be possible. You couldn't have quantum theory, you couldn't have relativity, you couldn't have fluid dynamics. And I now think that big data and AI will be to biological systems what calculus was to physics, complex biological systems. So I think we're on the cusp, of going from, a physics where we can't even explain a three-body problem to understanding and being able to create general rules for complex systems like the soil and how that interacts with micronutrients and how the role those play in the microbiome, the role the microbiome plays, and how that interrelates with both our immune system and our mental health. And I think that is going to be absolutely huge in the next 5 to 10 years, that massive expansion of biological science. I think, the most exciting thing, the most interesting thing that's happened in AI is not any of the generative AI, it's AlphaFold. And I think that ability to understand complex systems is going to explode. So the starting point is it's the second biggest transition. The Labour government need to tackle it if they're going to meet 2 of their 5 missions. The UK is really well placed to lead the way on this. And then you say to yourself, well, what have they promised so far? And as was kind of spelled out in the description of this talk, the answer is not very much. So if you go through the manifesto, which wasn't very long, with a fine tooth comb, there are a kind of handful of things that relate to food. There's a statement under economic economic foundations that we will reduce food prices by removing barriers to businesses trading. I'm not sure what that means. I haven't seen it explained anywhere what that means. I'm not sure how. I don't think that food prices are high because of barriers to business trading. They're high because of supply shocks in terms of climate change and fossil fuel price shocks, which affect the price of nitrogen fertilizer. But that was the first thing. The second thing is free breakfast clubs, which is fantastic, could be really powerful, also could actually improve if they're done not just with bagels, but by the school kitchens. It could bring a really fantastic new revenue into school kitchens, which covers their fixed costs and could help us improve school lunches. They say that they will continue to be bound by the Environment Act and the goal targets in the Environment Act, and the most important in this context are the commitment to try and stop the reduction in biodiversity by 2030 and then begin to increase biodiversity. They say on food security, and really the only thing it said about farming is that they will champion British farming while protecting the environment, which is, doesn't really mean very much. You can see it's more of a kind of a message to the farmers that we won't forget about you, but also to the NGOs that we understand the environment's important. They said that they will set a target for half of all food purchased across the public sector to be locally produced or certified to higher environmental standards. That is already a voluntary target in the government buying standards, so it's unclear what they would do that would, just setting a target doesn't really take you much further than you are today. Critically, they said they would introduce a land use framework. That is a big commitment, and make environment land management schemes work for farmers and nature. So at the heart of any transition is being really honest about the scarcest resource we have, our land. And it's fantastic that that is at the heart of the manifesto. The work is already undergoing in DEFRA, but it hasn't been published. It'll be highly political when it comes out, and it's great to see that they've done that. And then there were a couple of other things. They committed to banning advertising junk food to children, which the Tories had already committed to, albeit they kicked it back to October 25, and the sale of high caffeine energy drinks to under 16s, which the Tories had said they'd do. And then Sajid Javid said in June, I think, 2022, that was too much like the nanny state, so they pulled back. And then finally, they will publish a trade strategy. And here they say, which will promote the highest standards when it comes to food production. Now, I'm sure many people on this call will remember the Tories' manifesto commitment to protect British standards, which then they did Liz Truss did the Australian trade deal, which didn't do that at all. This is a similarly woolly commitment, promote the highest standards when it comes to food production. The question farmers want to know is, can people undercut them while producing food to lower standards? So if you look at the manifesto, very little, like the only really, for me, the hard commitments there that were different are free breakfast clubs, which is a huge commitment, a big deal, and the land use framework, but it's pretty thin meal. And then the King's Speech didn't really bring any other new news. In the speech itself, the King said that the government was going to legislate to restrict advertising on junk food. along with the sale of high caffeine energy drinks. Maybe that means that they're going to bring forward, given that King's speech is normally about a year, maybe they'll bring forward that the junk food ban, the advertising ban from October 2025, and introduce the caffeine ban. And then, not in the King's speech, but in the legislation below, they committed to doing the breakfast clubs legislation in this first political year. And what it's meant, this kind of this fuzziness, this lack of clarity, is that we have all across the country, and I think people are still doing this, projecting hopes and fears on this manifesto. You can look at this manifesto and you can think, well, it doesn't contradict anything I believe in, and I can see that, you know, I've got great hope that they're going to really get stuck into this and really set about changing the food system. Or you could say, well, it's, you know, depending on a mind, well, it's clear that they don't really care about this and there's nothing really substantial. It's open to interpretation. And I think that that was really intentional, because the sense that I got was they didn't want to put anything in the manifesto that could be weaponized against them. So that funny enough, I've been doing interviewing people, former secretary of states and prime ministers, about how difficult food policy is, and like why it's so hard to put in policy that improves health. And something that Sajid Javid said really rung true to me, which is a lot of this stuff, and he was talking about health, there aren't really votes in it. No one is going to vote for you because you want to restrict advertising, even though, as we saw in the food strategy, that was a very popular policy. It's not a vote-winning policy, but also it's not going to lose you votes. So Javid said to me, you know, if I were the Labour, I wouldn't say anything in the run-up to the election, and then after the election, I'd go, you know, get it all done, really go hard, and by the time it comes to the next election, everyone will have forgotten about it, and you will have got in the regulation that you wanted, and that is fine, but it has a problem, which is if you get resistance on something you try to do, if you have the policy in the manifesto, then you can say, look, we got this whopping majority against this policy. We have an electoral mandate to act here. And they don't have that electoral mandate really, because they haven't put anything specific into the food system. And that may or may not cause problems down the line. So, you know, having said that, you know, the critical ministers here, I think, Wes Streeting in health, and in on the environment, you've got Steve Reed and Dan Zeitner, who's the food and farming minister. And having spoken a bit to Streeting, I sense that he really understands this stuff. There's a lot of prevention in the manifesto, a lot of talk of prevention. And he clearly understands. Some people, when they talk about prevention, what they're actually talking about is early diagnosis and using AI to diagnose early and treat early when it's cheaper and you can have better outcomes. And that's really important, but it isn't prevention. And if you read between the lines in the manifesto, there is talk about kind of taking weight off the GPs, getting prevention into the community. And you can imagine that some of the things that I'll talk about later, like the kind of community eat well, prescribing of fruit and veg, having you know, coaching and training, like some of the policies we know really work. You could read that the manifesto was a nod to that. My concern is that I think Streeting has the battle of his life on his hands, trying to reform the NHS. And if you hear what he said, and if you read the manifesto, it's clear that he feels that Labour are the only party that can reform, clear to me anyway, that can reform the NHS, because they won't be accused of privatizing it or whatever it is. But I think there will at some point be a big left-wing rebellion. And the question I think that Streeting will have is, where does he spend his political capital? Does he spend it on the central NHS, the cure bit, and can he afford to spend political capital on prevention? But I'm an optimist generally, and I'm optimistic that he will try, and the manifesto suggests that he will try. On food and farming, I think you've got a really interesting combination. So one of the difficulties in landing food and farming policy has been that you have to show a positive future for all stakeholders, for farmers, for NGOs, for citizens in the future of the British countryside. And at the same time, you have to get the detail of the transition right. It's an incredibly complex thing, trying to get a system to give different outcomes through legislation, particularly in something like biodiversity, where it's just really hard to measure and to say what biodiversity is important and know how much you have to pay for different kinds of biodiversity. It's really hard. And what I saw in the 5 years I was in DEFRA as a lead non-exec, from 2018 to 2023, was that under Michael Gove and then George Eustace, briefly we had Therese Villiers in between, but largely the two long periods of Michael Gove and George Eustace, DEFRA was a department where there was a lot of optimism. The farmers were behind this transformation. The NGOs were excited about the idea of restoring nature and citizens more broadly. And that then fell apart in a number of ways. So it fell apart because, first of all, Liz Truss did the Australia trade deal. Behind the scenes on that, there was a massive fight between George Eustace and Michael Gove, who were trying to say, you cannot do this. You completely undermine everything we're trying to do, and you break our manifesto commitment to protect farmers or to maintain our trade standards. But Liz Truss won that. Boris Johnson wanted to make an announcement before a summit in Cornwall, and she won that. And that fundamentally, at that point, lost the trust of the farmers. And then when Liz Truss became Prime Minister, Ranil Jayawardena was in DEFRA, and he was talking about DEFRA as a growth department, and lost the trust of the NGOs. And then once the trust is gone, it's very, very difficult. So Therese Coffey, who actually internally was really focused on biodiversity and carbon targets, those legal targets, took them very seriously from the Environment Bill. By that stage, everyone just on every side assumed she was acting in against their interests. And so why do I kind of say that? Because I think that what it illustrates is you need in a government department both a heavy-hitting political communicator and someone who's on the detail. And Steve Reed is definitely the former. And Dan Zeitner, versus any politician I've met, probably really understands, is a systems thinker and really gets it. And so there is again in that department opportunity and optimism that they might continue the transition and go in the right direction. So the question then becomes, what do they need to do? What should they do in the next 100 days? And the short answer is they need to set out their stall. They've won the election. They need to say what they're going to do. They need to publish, not just, as they've said, a land use framework, but an overall food systems approach. And luckily for them, and I would say this, they've got the framework of that in the food strategy. This is for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it, basically fundamentally we diagnose the two problems in the food system as coming from two broken feedback loops. One we call the junk food cycle, which is the interaction between our ancient evolved appetite that makes us seek out and eat foods that are high in sugar, fat, and salt. When those foods are, as much ultra processed food is, soft, low in water, calorie dense, and low in insoluble fiber, it fills us up less quickly. We eat more. Food companies have noticed that, not because they're bad people, but because that's where the money is. They spent more and more money creating those things. We've eaten more, they've spent more money, we've eaten more, we've got sick. 85% of the foods that the big FMCG companies make are deemed by the WHO to be too unhealthy to market to children. And if you want to tackle that problem, you have to do one of two things. You have to break the junk food cycle, and you either do that by tackling the commercial incentives of the companies, or you do it by changing the evolved appetite, which wasn't something we used to think was possible, but now with appetite suppressant drugs, that is no longer the case. And I can see a future where we don't have the strength to change the food system fundamentally, and we drug our way out of it. 19% of our population are on antidepressants. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the same with appetite suppressing drugs. And we probably don't have time to go into today. I think that stores up long-term problems down the line. And then the other feedback loop that needs to be fixed is the invisibility of nature. And this is simply the fact that nature, we shouldn't be surprised that we're destroying nature at such a rate, because it's invisible in all of the systems that we use to measure human success, in our wallets, in the balance sheets of companies, in the way nations measure their GDP. And you just need to put nature into the system, into the way we measure things, and pay for public goods, and charge the polluter, and you should rather rapidly be able to change those outcomes. So we recommended kind of four kinds of four strategic imperatives: break the junk food cycle, reduce diet related inequality. So as well as making it harder to sell junk food, actually make sure that those living in poverty had access to fresh fruit and veg, make the best use of the land, so continue with the environmental transition, and then create a long-term shift in our food culture. And there are 14 recommendations against that, and I think that the Labour Party should do them with a few adjustments. And I think I might just end by talking about the kind of what I think should go into the plan. So I think that in escaping the junk food cycle, I think that we recommended a sugar and salt reformulation tax. I don't think it's possible to do that, so politically charged. It's very difficult to do that without a mandate. But I do think at the next budget they could easily extend that the sugary drinks levy to milky drinks, move it out, and then maybe at the next election get the mandate to do that. The second things I think are really important: mandatory reporting for large food companies. That is happening, but really slowly. So actually getting companies to say how much unhealthy food they sell, how much meat they sell, the environmental footprint of their food. It's stuck in DEFRA and in DHSC at the moment. They need to grab that and just give it a good kick and make it happen. They also need to, on the schools front, to make accreditation mandatory. So accreditation of no one looks at school food or school education. They need to make the accreditation for that mandatory. In terms of, there's one other thing that wasn't in the food strategy, and I deeply regret it now, which is something on wholemeal. So fiber is the biggest thing that's lacking in our diet. In Denmark and in Singapore, the government have successfully made 50-50 the norm, 50-50 pasta, 50-50 rice, etc., massively increasing the amount of fiber people eat. And, I've come to believe that wholemeal pasta is disgusting, and, well, not disgusting, but it's not like pasta. 50-50 pasta tastes just as good as pasta. It's almost impossible to get a hold of. It would have been such a simple thing to have brought together a coalition of supermarkets to say, we will make 50-50 the norm. And that's something I would add, pull that coalition together. In terms of reducing diet-related inequality, Free school meals is a scandal. It's still at £7,400 pre-benefits eligibility. That needs to go up. But I think the thing that I would really push on, thanks to the Alexander Rose work, is what we called Community Eat Well, which is giving fruit and vegetables, prescribing fruit and vegetables, people living in poverty. It is unbelievably effective, not surprisingly. Alexander Rose saw the number of children eating 5 a day going from under 10% to 64%. Parents were less stressed. I'd put a big emphasis on that. And then on the farming transition, keep going, but be really clear on two things. On the land use framework, really, Steve Reed needs to step up with the land use framework and say, here is a vision for the future of our countryside, where there is an optimistic future for everyone, but there are trade-offs that need to be made on how we use our land. And our legislation will support farmers to help make those changes. And critically, we will not repeat the Australia trade deal. We will protect our farmers, not only protect our farmers, but see our food imports as a soft way of using soft power to export those high standards abroad. And then finally, I think we recommended that there should be a statutory target on health, which there isn't. And then, like the Climate Change Committee, an annual review, which we said should be pulled together by the FSA with input from the Climate Change Committee, with input from the Office for Environmental Protection, that says, here is progress, society's progress against these food-related targets, and here is advice for government on the kinds of policies that are necessary. Because what food doesn't have, even though it is the second biggest, as I said at the start, societal transition I think we need to go through, there's no mechanism for keeping it current in a political system, either for one party or in the transition of powers between different governments. And that is a real problem, because another thing that we found when we were interviewing, as I said, these Secretary of States and these prime ministers, was that this was in each government department, this was a second or third order problem that added up to a first order problem, but it was never on the top 10 to-do list of Secretary of States when they came into those departments. And having that mechanism in the same way that the Stern report recommended for climate change would just keep it on the agenda and create an impetus for government to be able to continue making policy in this area. So that would be my overall request from Labour, which is basically tell us what you're going to do, because we're all trying to read the tea leaves from your manifesto and your King's Speech. But if you want this transition to work, you need to tell us what you're going to do, and you need to set out a positive vision for all of your stakeholders in this system, so that they can see themselves in 10 years' time in a positive future, and not a future in which their livelihoods, lifestyles have been harmed, destroyed by this huge societal transition. And I think I'm going to leave it there. And I would just say, I've been trying to keep up as I've been talking with the questions and the comments, but it's really fascinating. So Christina's going to come back now and put some of the questions, but I think we're going to pull all these off and send them to everyone, because just like put your wisdom in there, there's some really, really fascinating stuff come through. So comments as well as questions, please. As I said at the beginning, many of you are much greater experts in your area of expertise than I am. So really looking forward to learning from what you've got to say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Henry. It's been really insightful, particularly your inside knowledge of politics, and how politics actually shapes what happens or what doesn't happen. So that's been really, really helpful and useful for everyone. As you can see, we've got the questions flooding in. So there are a range of questions and comments. I'm going to start with one around the point you mentioned about using trade as a leverage point to spread environmental standards, and really the question is, isn't economic growth as the target for Labor around, you know, growing the economy, isn't that likely to overshadow opportunities for trade to spread environmental standards and more likely to undermine environmental standards? I mean, I know you say to learn from the Australian trade deal, but what do you mean by that, and what are the actual opportunities around that?
So when we do trade deals, because we are the fourth biggest importer of food, what other countries look at? That is one of the first things on their agenda. And when that gives us power. And when we negotiated the Australian trade deal afterwards, the Australian commentators were amazed by how we didn't use this power. So one of them said that they were the kinds of things that we negotiated with Australians were the equivalent of the Swiss saying they wouldn't build a navy, like they were completely meaningless. And so there was no reason not to put some environmental protections into the Australian trade deal, so that, you know, for example, all of the meat, the carbon footprint of meat produced, or beef produced in Australia, is significantly higher carbon footprint than ours. It's still being produced on land that's being removed of trees. It would have been relatively straightforward to put that in. They almost certainly would have signed the trade deal anyway, and you would have exported some good practice abroad. And this isn't a crazy idea. So, but if there are any organic milk farmers on this call, they will know that that the organic standards in America are higher than the organic standards are here. In particular, if you put a cow on antibiotics in America, you are not allowed to return that cow to the herd, whereas in a British organic herd, you are allowed to take the cow out while they're antibiotics, but bring them back to the herd. And so if you want to, we export a lot of milk fat to organic milk fat to America. And if you want to do that, you have to get accredited for the American organic standards. So this already happens. And there's no reason that we couldn't have said, as at the time Michael Gove and George Eustace were arguing, we are holding our farmers to a high standard. And if you want to compete with them, we're very happy for you to compete with them, but you have to do it on a level playing field. And here is the accreditation that you need in certain areas to import food into this country.
Do you believe now internally there'll be sufficient will to make that happen? Because it's interesting, if you seem to think that it was so easy, it didn't happen with the Conservative when there was a sort of leverage point. Do you think that internally that's changed, and that Daniel Zeichner might, you know,
well, it'll be, but again, you see, it's, you know, it will be exactly the same issues. So the manifesto is, you know, it has this line that I talked about earlier, where it says, we will publish a trade strategy and use every lever available to get US businesses the access it needs to international markets. This will promote the highest standards when it comes to food production. So you will have exactly the same situation potentially, which is, if you have a trade secretary who wants to get a trade deal over the line fast, you know, to show. Someone once described Liz Truss's approach to trade deals as supermarket sweep, you know, going round, didn't care what the quality was, she just wanted to get as many trade deals into the basket in the time done. If you get a trade minister in Labour for whom that is a priority, you will get what happened, where you have the two departments in government arguing with each other at an official level. And in the end, it will go to Keir Starmer, it will go to the Prime Minister. So I don't know. It's not possible to tell from the manifesto whether that has been resolved or not. I'm pretty sure, having known Dan Zeichner for a long time now, but he's been following the food scene very closely. And I think anyone who, you know, a lot of people in the food system have met him, and I think it's pretty clear that he would be arguing for that, but who knows?
And we'll always be championing that for nutrition in trade deals as well. A bit harder, no doubt, but
very hard in terms of very hard to see how that regulation works. I mean, but yes, it's hard because you're allowed to sell, you know, clearly, if we had a, you know, as is the case at the moment, if there's a sugary drinks levy or a sugar tax, then that should apply to imported food. But it's hard to know that the argument that people make is that if you open up your market to America, you expose yourself not to, it's not the fundamental nature of the food, it's the hugely increased marketing budgets that would hit your market. So the junk food cycle would go into hyperdrive. That's
Right.
and it's hard to see a legislative, it's hard to know what we looked at this, we couldn't find a workable kind of trade solution to that.
Further research to be done in that area then.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to questions that are coming in. They're coming in thick and fast, and we're not going to get through them all, but I'll do my very best to tackle some. So Emily Hackett has asked, why is it so challenging to elevate food policy on the political agenda in the UK, despite its critical importance to public health, environmental sustainability, and economic stability? Sorry. So just what are your key thoughts around that?
So we thought a lot about this question, and what we concluded was that systems are really boring. So you can get people interested. If you think about campaigning, you can get people interested in outcomes. So you can get them interested in rubbish on the streets. You can get them interested in street crime. You can get them interested in obesity. Actually, you can get them interested, you know, when that became, Jamie Oliver managed to get that little bit of food, and actually to get people interested, it had to be childhood obesity, even though that is a problem, but it's not the main problem. And so that was the first thing, is that it's just hard to get people interested in the system. And then the second thing is that it is, as we said in the food strategy, the responsibility is spread like a kind of thin layer of jam on toast. So it is DCMS that regulates advertising. It is DEFRA that does farming. It is education that does school meals. Every government department has some responsibility for food. So that makes a joined up approach difficult. That's why the legislative approach is really important in my view. And then the third thing is just like, is it vote winning? So a lot of it is in the kind of neither here nor there category. It's stuff that you could easily fix, but it's not vote winning, so it's not a priority.
I think that's really interesting. I've got a question here that is, you know, what is West Streeting's potential to work across departments? So much of the prevention agenda is across government departments, as you just mentioned, you know, it's outside of health. And particularly that's for development implementation, but also enforcement, which we're just seeing is not happening for many of our food programs. So HFSS positioning, for example, free school meal standards, you know, there's lots of different examples of that. So what is the particular strategy? So you talk about legislation, and I guess the plan is an across government agreement, but what's the likelihood that actually there can be a cross-department agreement?
Well, so it's again, we spent a long time thinking about this. What tends to happen with these things is that basically you have to have either a cabinet office or a number 10 delivery unit that pulls together all those bits of government. And that was achieved with climate change because of the Stern report. So statutory targets, and then BEIS, as was Department of Business, giving carbon allocations to each government department, saying you have to resolve this. What was different about that from other delivery things is that what normally happens with those delivery things is there'll be a meter cross-departmental implementation group, and it will start off with a great fanfare and everyone will turn up, and then gradually fewer people turn up and the ministers will get busy and it'll peter out. What the what the study review did and the climate change committee did and the statutory targets did with climate change is it stopped it petering out. So I think fundamentally you need, again, that's why we had the 14th recommendation. You need something statutory that keeps the energy up. Otherwise, you know, people come in with this is exciting, we're all going to get together, we're going to solve this, and then gradually they all have their own problems, and personnel leave, director generals or other, you know, senior civil servants move on, cabinet ministers move on, and it just, you know, peters out.
Yeah, linked to that, Anthony So has asked about the role of the Competition and Markets Authority in actually making, you know, commercial determinants and commercial incentives, reshaping them to actually be beneficial for health and sustainability, particularly around health. Do you see them playing a role, or do you see it very much being sort of sat more with the FSA?
I mean, it's a good question. I never thought about it like that. I mean, I had always thought of them as dealing with monopolistic, you know, market, you know, skewed market issues. I mean, so I'm not sure. I think the FSA would have a better grasp on the issues, and they would. I mean, interesting. The FSA. So, as again, as a lot of people on this call will know, the FSA has been through some quite interesting development. So at the time of the salt reformulation, voluntary salt targets, public health was moved out of the FSA back into the Department for Health. I've heard speculation there was a deal done on that, but you know, who knows? And it now still sits in the Department for Health. Under the previous government, the FSA was had wanted to talk about, started talking about, you know, food safety as not just being poisoning, you know, the kind of classic food safety issues, but also being health and even a little bit environment. They were put firmly back in their box by Steve Barclay, who said, I don't want you talking about obesity. So I think that there is actually, you know, if Wes Streeting wanted to do one thing, if he wanted to, for himself, kick the can down the line, re-empowering the FSA to engage on these topics would not be a bad place to start. It's something you could do very quickly and without legislation, and I think would begin to change the mood music and actually potentially help in a meaningful way.
Great. Moving on to a question from Lucy Antel. So she says, where's the citizen in this? My experience of academia and policymakers is that they are very far from the front lines around reasonable access to fresh food. She'd be interested to hear how that might be tackled to ensure that people aren't left behind and done to, rather than working alongside. I know Labor did have some citizen sort of panels outlined in their manifesto, but your thoughts on this would be really helpful.
So we did quite a lot of work with citizens. I had a advisory panel which had kind of bigwigs from the food system, but also had two people who had lived experience of struggling with food poverty. We conducted citizens dialogues with demographically proportionate groups from 5 areas of the of England, because this was not a devolved, this is a devolved issue. And I found both of those things incredibly useful, both in terms of really thinking about the nitty-gritty of the policy, but also in terms of understanding what had political, where you could get things, where there was kind of electoral consensus to do things, and which, you know, actually we're a lot less nanny state than you think, and where there would be problems. People got really angry about meat and any government intervention on meat. Not everyone, but enough people to make it really problematic. How you build that in ongoing into you know, the civil service and government is a really difficult question. Government departments tend to have a character of their own that is unchanged over decades. They tend to serve their client stakeholders, not the public. You know, and not in a bad way, just those are the people they talk to, and government hasn't found a way of bringing in, I think, really close listening to the voices of civil society. I think there are risks in it. So I think, you know, I citizens assemblies where they are not advisory but are a kind of challenge to the democracy of to the elected parliament, I think are problematic. I think we saw from Brexit that if you have competitive claims to a democratic mandate, it can cause, you know, the House of Commons can't deal with it. But I would be very much in favour of, you know, we kind of thought, you know, do you have people who are picked by lot as they were in ancient Greece? You know, do you have semi-permanent groups of citizens who are constantly advising departments on policy? I think that would be a fantastic thing. But again, it's not in the top 10 lists on anyone's to-do list when they come in. So it probably will go on being as it has been for the last decades, you know, until someone decides. I mean, I think that the election, you know, populism and all of that, you know, there is something creaking about the way our democracy is working at the moment. There are clearly a lot of people who don't feel represented. So maybe there is some way in which the franchise is extended. I mean, Labour wants to extend the franchise to 16, although that wasn't in the King's speech. You know, it might be that actually we do need that the pressure gets strong enough that we do need to change the way we do democracy, but it's not happening at the moment.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's a serious commitment to that, where there's capacity building on both ways, and knowledge, true knowledge exchange, and there's commitment so that it can work, and trusting relationships can be built. Thank you. Viola King Forbes has said, "Hi Henry, really interested in the point that you made about how to think about complex systems and what AI can do. I'm wondering then how you envisage using data in a way that is socially responsible, not purely top down, and given the risk posed by large uncertainty ranges and the need for sensitivity to tailor insights to local contexts."
So I think that one thing I'm quite excited about is that Patrick Vallance is a science minister. He's the first scientist ever to be science minister. And fun enough, it was the Natural History Museum's opening of their garden last night, which I went to, and he was there. And I went up to him and said, "You're a sucker for punishment." But I do think that this data issue, particularly the NHS data issue and data trusts, and who you allow access to that data, is so critical. And an approach that is not, you know, that is risk based and not overly cautious. And he was always, when I was in government, he was very interested in data and very interested in how that could be used. So that is something, you know, if we think about the fundamental wiring of government, the power of that data, if set free and if it is allowed to be used responsibly by people, could transform our health service. But it needs, you know, it needs someone wise and who understands politics leading it. He's one of the few ministers who actually who's seen government work from the inside. So, you know, I hope I'm not putting too much on his shoulders by suggesting that could be quite an exciting thing for him to look at.
Yeah. Watch this space. The first science minister that actually knows science, hey? Rachel Childs has a question. As you've mentioned in your previous work, the early years are a critical time to set the foundations for lifetime good health. However, the Labor manifesto largely fails to acknowledge the particular food and nutrition requirements of babies and young children, and the factors that make eating well a challenge for many young families. How do we ensure that actions in the early years are included among food policy priorities?
So it doesn't largely not mention them. It just doesn't mention them, but it doesn't mention much. So I think, you know, there are 400 people on this call, and I think the one thing that we need to be doing is is really thinking carefully about how we campaign with this Labour government. They weren't really challenged on policy at all during the campaign. It was such a weird campaign, and it was all, you know, all we cared about was D-Day and betting and anti-Semitism and, you know, all of the, you know, Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn, and there was no serious analysis really on either side of the party's manifesto in a way that certainly in my lifetime I've never seen. And I think that the role of civil society now is to say, well, actually, we kind of missed a trick. Like normally, what you're trying to do is make sure that the manifesto is challenged. And so I think that the single most important thing that civil society can be doing in relation to food is holding the government to account, being clear about what is expected, and holding the government account as they have done with governments, governments forever. And I just think we went through such a chaotic period. We've been through, when I was at DEFRA, we had four, this is like ancient history now. We had four going up to the hill and back down again on no deal Brexit. We had to prepare for 4 times. Then as soon as we got Brexit done, we had COVID. And then as we came out of that, we had the Ukraine war. And we had 4 prime ministers. And so I think there was a kind of suspension of the normal challenge to governments in politics. And I think that, you now have a government with a majority of over 170. We need to start holding them to account and making sure that they are, they do the substantial rewiring of this particular system that is required for us to have a healthier and more productive future.
Great. That links very nicely into a question from Emily O'Brien, who says, what will be the role of diverse opposition parties in holding Labour to account, including 4 new Green MPs, bearing in mind that the Green Party committed in their manifesto to implementation of the food strategy and putting nature front and centre? Emily is a cabinet minister for the Greens in Bristol, in Lewis, sorry.
In Lewis. So it's interesting, I would say. So I thought the Greens, what was fascinating about the Greens result was not just that they won 4 seats, and 2 of which took a lot of people by surprise, but also the strength of the underlying vote. I can't remember if it had been PR, they would have had 30, 40 seats, something like that. I can't remember the exact number. But you have in them and the Lib Dems let's start with Lib Dems. It's really unclear to me where the Lib Dems stand. It's unclear to me where they stand. They went through a period where on food, where they were having kind of been quite progressive and environmentally kind of supportive of the environment. They went through a period, I think, before the election, because they had some kind of rural seats of saying, let's go back to BPS, let's go back to the old ways, paying farmers for producing food and protecting our food security. That was really weird, and I haven't quite worked out from the manifesto where they stand on that. I think on land use, we have a real struggle to deliver. We delivered for the whole of kind of human history until the Industrial Revolution. Everything we produced came from the land, and then we found fossil fuels, and suddenly we were only producing a much more limited range of goods from the land, and now we can't use fossil fuels anymore, and we need the land for so many things, for nature, for materials, for energy. And that land use framework is going to require trade-offs. And so I think, as they were on the radio this morning saying, we're absolutely not going to build on whatever it looks like on greenfield land, felt like not an interesting nuanced position. So I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see where the Lib Dems come up. I think on the food, I think that the Greens, you know, as I said, they pushed the food strategy. Caroline Lucas has been a fantastic supporter of this agenda, and you know, she's actually behind the scenes on all sorts of interesting things where she's helped me get stuff done. But again, I worry that there are elements of the green agenda, and I may be wrong about this, but there are kind of, you know, I worry about nuclear fuel. I know that's not food, but it kind of is food, because if you don't use nuclear, then there's a lot more pressure on the land to produce energy. And I can't see any other way of getting the base load done. I worry a little bit about gene editing. I think with climate change, you're going to need in certain countries to have gene edited crops. So, you know, I really hope they hold the government to account, but I think largely I understand where the Greens are coming from, but I don't have any idea where the Lib Dems are coming from. I need to go and speak to my friend Andy Richardson, who's a very good Lib Dem and really cares about food systems, and get him to tell me what they really think.
Do share it. Thank you. So we've got two questions that are related, so I'm going to go between two. So one from Antoinette Salah and the other from Prue Elliott. And really, they both are focused on access to land in urban areas to grow fresh food. And Antoinette says it's a limiting factor to urban food security. What approaches or incentives are the current government in partnership with landowners? What should they take to improve access to land for urban farming? And then Prue Elliott says, you mentioned that we have a chance to show how we're changing the world. Sorry, it just jumped there. And so having a chance to show how changing the food system can be done, and in a way that we can lead the way. But what opportunities are there for us to learn about urban farming and community growing, as strong bans on pesticides, etc., have been shown in Argentina and also Cuba? And how do you think we can encourage policymakers to pay attention to existing urban solutions, particularly around sort of urban growing?
So, funny enough, this feeds into the previous conversation we were having on planning. So, one of the problems with allotments and creating spaces for people to grow urban, it's very difficult to change agricultural land into allotment land. And so there just isn't the land to do it. And that for me, making it clear that you could just do that without any planning permission would be a huge, there's huge demand, you know, unmet demand for allotments, and that single change would be huge. Funnily enough, I don't think it's about food security. So if you look at the amount of food that you can produce in allotment, and you know, it's not an efficient way to produce food, but for me, it's so important. It's important for two things. So it's important, first of all, I don't think there is any transition to a better food system, which fundamentally means we need to eat cook more from scratch, which doesn't involve more people, particularly children, growing food. And people say, oh, I live in the real world, it's never going to happen, UPF is out of the box, etc., etc. I don't buy that. Cultural change happens all the time, and it's and it's possible that will happen. So it's really important to me for cultural reasons, and it's really important to me for mental health reasons. One of the most fantastic things you can do for your mental health. I don't think it's about food security, but I do think it's really important. And the fundamental thing that needs to be unblocked is the access to land to enable you to do. I live in Hackney, and the council here have been absolutely brilliant about letting people, like, basically, if you leave a bit of land unused for too much time, the council will let people grow veg there, which is great. So we've got all these little, you wander around, there are all these little tiny farms in like car park lot size bits of land awaiting planning permission.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just I'll do sort of two more questions if we can. One was around sort of the breakfast clubs, and there was lots of agreement and comments online that the breakfast clubs are an excellent idea, as long as they adhere to nutritional standards and that's monitored. But is there the need for a broader strategy for addressing household insecurity, particularly food insecurity, and something that you know, that they said, Labor said that they wanted to end food parcels in their manifesto, but haven't said how they'll do that. What would be the broader strategy for inequality, and what would that look like? You know, something like, they haven't mentioned anything around Healthy Start or free school meals auto enrollment, and even their eligibility criteria being aligned, and, you know, keeping up with inflation. Nothing about sort of a living minimum wage. And then related to this, Corinne Bell sort of said she's questioning about food prices, and should food prices go down, or should we accept that food prices are going up as long as we can help communities that are, you know, experiencing food insecurity?
So I think that, you know, in both those questions, there's an underlying point which is obvious but needs to be made, which is the problem is not the food system, it's poverty and it's inequality, and that is a much bigger problem to solve. And that's not something I'm an expert in, is how do you increase productivity, how do you create growth, and how do you make sure that growth is at the bottom end as well as the top end of the income spectrum. Having said that, given that we live in a hugely unequal society and there are people really struggling, I fundamentally believe there's really good evidence to show that benefits in kind, i.e. not just giving people money, but giving them free school meals, Healthy Start, community eat well, can be, that's a way that you can spend money which has a disproportionate impact from just giving that money in terms of additional benefits. And clearly they've earmarked 400 million, 350 million, 400 million, something for the breakfast. They looked at the cost of extending free school meals, which is about $1 billion to do universal. They looked at the cost of Healthy Start, etc., etc., and they've just thought, we can't, for the manifesto, commit to that because we'll be attacked on budget. If the economy grows, you know, already there seems to be a bit more room. I absolutely think that those benefits should be expanded. You should have auto enrollment in schools. I fundamentally believe in universal free school meals. I think it has much bigger societal impact than just the free school meals, and they haven't said anything on that. And, you know, again, there was a lot on that in the National Food Strategy, and I think they should just do it when they can financially.
Yeah, fully agree. Do you think that budget constraints are a major limitation around that?
Well, it's, you know, in the scheme of things, it's not big, but it's, you know, I've seen a spending round happen, and Treasury's job is to stop the fundamental job is to stop departments spending money, and you get a lot of pressure on you, and you'll be literally, it'll come down to, there's this 800 million here, and this, you know, it's a tiny part of the overall pie, but in the end, there's not, like, you can't, you know, you can't stop paying the big cost. You can't stop paying pensions. You can't stop paying benefits. You can't stop. So once you look, you know, the National Health Service is ring fenced. So once you look at all of that stuff, actually the available wiggle room is much, much smaller than you think. And so inevitably those spending constraints, those are the discussions that are had.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. We've got one final question before we close. This is from Miles Bremer, who says, hi, Henry, both your school food plan and the National Food Strategy Plan set out a collective number of actions to transform the system. Can Labor only be successful if they set out, can they only be successful if they set out a holistic food plan, or can discrete separate actions work just as well?
So it's a really good question. So fundamentally, I think we talked about, and Miles helped to implement. He led the implementation of the school food plan, and in the school food plan, we talked about Pekka Puska, who was, and we talked about it in Ravenous, the book we wrote about the food strategy as well. This Finnish health, it ended up running their health service, but he started off trying to resolve the fact they had the worst rate in the 70s. They had the worst rates of coronary heart disease in the world. And he talked about having to get your boots deep in the mud to shift the system. You can't have little, you have to do everything everywhere all at once, just do it, and that kicks it. And so I think you do need to do a lot of things, but you also, there are certain really, and if you just do little things, the system will respond, and it will, they'll have, there's almost no point in doing one or two small things. The system will respond, nothing will happen. You have to give complex systems quite a big kick. And I do think there are some, the sugar and salt reformulation tax would have been that kind of kick. I actually think the advertising restrictions will be more powerful than people think. I think they'll lead to quite fundamental changes. So I think the answer is, if you're only going to do one or two things, they have to be quite big things. There's almost no point in just getting people to put calories on restaurant menus. That in its own, that's going to do nothing. In fact, I actually think the evidence is that doesn't really work. But anyway, that's for another day. So yes, you have to, and I think you have to have a narrative. You have to have a vision, and you have to. The other thing is, you don't know. Honestly, you cannot say what is going to happen to a complex system when you have put in a certain, when you make an intervention of some form. So the other thing you have to be able to do is respond and react, and accept that you don't know what's going to work.
It's interesting what you say about that long-term vision. Some of the work that we did with food industry, they were calling on a long-term roadmap so that they could plan and invest.
So they're desperate for. I was at a thing the other day, like one of the things that really frustrated them on this, the bog offs, which actually the Labour government haven't mentioned, which they're due to come in October 2025 as well, restrictions on bog offs. I was talking to the CEO of a fast-moving consumer good companies the other day, and he was like, "For goodness sake, just tell us what you're going to do and do it." We did so much work getting ready for that, and then suddenly on a whim it goes, and it's really hard in that environment to operate. So yes,
absolutely.
I agree.
Yeah,
Set a
and the
vision,
importance of monitoring and evaluation that you mentioned about uncertainty about what the feedback loops will be, or what the consequences or impact will be. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful, Henry. Thank you very, very much. We've had an excellent attendance today, so thank you everyone for your engagement through the Q&A. Henry, it's been an excellent conversation and an overview, and we really look forward to seeing whether Labor do fulfil your recommendation of coming up with a plan, at least of what they can do around food systems, and how many of your recommendations fit into that you listed today. So we will watch this watch this space with interest. I have to end to say I'm a fan of wholemeal pasta. I'm one of those.
Are your children a fan of wholemeal pasta? Is the question?
Yeah, she does eat it. Even my husband. But no, thank you very, very much, and just thank you everyone for joining. We are taking a break over August, but we will be back in autumn. Thanks again, Henry.
Thank you, and I look forward to reading all of the questions and responses. Thank you so much. It's been really fun to do.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.